My name is Dr. Tessa Calderon, and I am 34 years old. 7 years ago, my brother told my parents that I had quietly washed out of my surgical residency for falsifying patient records. None of it was true. Not one word. But that single invented story, delivered to my mother on a Sunday evening over a speakerphone in our family kitchen, cost me everyone I was related to by blood. They stopped answering when I called. They sent my letters back. They were not at the ceremony where I received my board certification, not at my fellowship graduation, not in the courthouse hallway on the morning I married my husband. For 7 years, I belonged to no one I shared a last name with. And then, 4 weeks ago, my brother was carried into the emergency department of my hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning, pinned in by a collapsed dashboard, his pulse thready, his abdomen rigid and full of blood. The attending trauma surgeon on duty that night was me. When my father came running through the ambulance doors behind the gurney and read the names stitched in blue thread above the pocket of the surgeon giving orders, he stopped walking in the middle of the corridor and put one hand flat against the wall, as though the floor of the building had shifted underneath him. He did not collapse. He simply could not, for a moment, make his body continue forward. Before we go any further into this, take a second and tap the like button and subscribe if this is the first time you have found your way here. Tell me in the comments which city you are listening from tonight, because I genuinely love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let me take you back. Back to a kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, in the late spring of 2017, and the single evening of my entire childhood when my mother looked at me with something I had spent 22 years waiting to see on her face. There were 2 children in the Calderon household, and for almost the whole of my life, you only ever needed to know about one of them. My brother, Mateo, is 3 years older than me. He arrived in this world already understanding how to hold a room. By the time he was 9, he was the boy other parents wished was theirs, the one who got asked back to family lake houses because he made the adults laugh and never tracked mud on the carpet. He was handsome in an easy, unbothered way, fluent with grown-ups, comfortable being looked at. My parents orbited him without ever quite realizing they were doing it. My father, Rafael Calderon, who managed 3 car dealerships across Northeast Ohio, prized exactly 2 qualities in a human being: a person who looked good in a showroom, and a person who never made him explain himself to the neighbors. Mateo was both. My mother, Gloria, who worked the front desk of a busy orthodontics practice, took her cues from my father on nearly every decision the 2 of them ever made about their children, including the one they never said out loud, which was that the family already had its centerpiece and did not require a second one. I was the other one, the quiet one, the girl who, at the big, noisy family gatherings, would drift away from the table when the dessert plates came out and find the emptiest upstairs room to read in until it was time to go home. I want to be honest with you. I was not miserable. I was not even, for most of my childhood, especially aware of being passed over. When you are born the second child into a family that has already chosen its lead actor, you do not feel the lack of attention as a wound that bleeds. You feel it the way you feel the temperature of the town you grew up in. It is simply the weather. You learn to dress for it, and you go about your day. There is one memory I keep returning to, because it explains the entire shape of my childhood in about 90 seconds. When I was 10, I won the citywide Young Scientists competition with a project on water filtration. Not the classroom round, not the school round, the whole city. I was the only student from my district to place first. The award ceremony was on a Saturday afternoon. That same Saturday, Mateo had a regional baseball tournament 40 minutes outside the city. My parents went to the tournament. My father came to collect me from the science fair an hour after the ribbons had been handed out, idling at the curb outside the convention center, where I had been sitting on the front steps, holding a blue rosette and a folder with my certificate inside. He did not turn off the engine. He leaned across and pushed the passenger door open and said, "Get in, Mika. Your brother went 2 for 4. I put the ribbon in my lap and the folder on the floor, and I closed the door. And that was the entirety of any conversation our family ever had about the citywide Young Scientists competition. The ribbon stayed pinned to the corkboard in my room for 4 years. Nobody ever once asked me what the project had been about. It had been about water filtration. I have thought about that for a very long time. I told myself all through middle school and high school that I did not need their attention, that I had larger plans than they could see. I loaded my schedule with every advanced course the school offered. I joined the academic decathlon team. I started volunteering at a hospice center the week I turned 15 because it was the only place I had ever stood where adults turned toward me when I spoke and answered my questions as though the questions deserved answers. By the time I was a senior, I was running quietly on a single unspoken theory, which was that if I could not be the child they noticed, I would become the child they could not look past. And for one bright evening in the early summer after I graduated, I very nearly managed it. The letter arrived on a Thursday in June. I had applied to 8 medical schools and been accepted to 5. The envelope I had been most afraid to open, the one I had carried unopened in my bag for half a day, was from Duke University School of Medicine in North Carolina, more than 500 miles from Cleveland, with a scholarship that covered nearly the entire cost. My father read the acceptance letter at the kitchen table that evening, with the back door open and the smell of the neighbor's grill drifting in. He read it twice. Then he set it down flat on the table, and he looked up at me, and my mother, standing at the counter with a dish towel in her hands, looked at me too. And she said, in a voice I had never once heard her aim in my direction in 22 years, "Tessa, look at you. Look at what you did." Pride. Plain, undefended, surprised pride. For perhaps 3 hours on a Thursday evening in June, I was the daughter my parents had not realized they had been raising. And across the kitchen, leaning against the door frame with a beer in his hand and a smile that only used the bottom half of his face, my brother was already, quietly, beginning to calculate. Matteo was 25 then. 2 years out of a business degree he had coasted through on charm, working as an account manager at a marketing agency downtown, in a job he described, when our parents were not in the room, as a holding pattern. He had always assumed that he would be the Calderon whose name got mentioned at the dealership, the one whose success my father would brag about to customers. He had never once factored in the possibility that the quiet one with the books, the sister who never said much at the dinner table, might be on her way to becoming a surgeon 5 states away. He did not see it as a competition he had lost. He saw it as a competition he had not known he was in, and had been losing the entire time without being told the rules. That night, I did not see any of that. What I saw was a brother who crossed the kitchen and put his arm around my shoulders and said, "I always knew you had it in you, Tess." I believed him. I went on believing him for almost 6 more years. He began calling me more often. That was the first sign, though I did not read it as a sign. In the months before I left for Durham, Matteo, who in 22 years had never once called me without a concrete reason, started checking in every week, sometimes twice. Long, unhurried conversations on his lunch break. What did my class schedule look like? What were my roommates' names? How was the program structured? What were my professors called? He asked about my anatomy lab partner, my study group, the people on my floor, the manager of my apartment building, the diner on the corner where I went on Sunday mornings to read ahead for the week. He remembered every name I gave him. He would mention them again 2 calls later, casually, woven into the conversation. How is your friend from the cardiology rotation? How is the woman who runs the diner? I thought my brother had finally decided to know me. I thought that becoming someone had at last made me worth his curiosity. I was, of course, drawing him a floor plan of my life. Every name was a future witness he would never actually need to call. Every detail was a thread he could pull on at the moment of his choosing. He was assembling a complete and intimate portrait of my life in North Carolina, one he could turn into a weapon whenever it served him. And I, lonely and grateful, and finally feeling like I had a brother, helped him fill in every blank. The 4th year of training is where the whole thing came apart. By then, I had become very close, the closest I have ever been to another human being who was not my husband, with a woman in my program named Priya Anand. Priya had grown up entirely inside the foster system in rural Kentucky. She had no family in any direction at all. Her mother had died when she was 7, and there had never been a father in the picture. And she had moved through 5 homes before she aged out at 18 and put herself through college on grants and the tips she made waiting tables at a truck stop off the interstate. She was the smartest person in our entire cohort, and without any competition, the kindest. She was the only person I had ever told the full truth about my family. Late one night during our 1st year, sitting on the floor of a call room eating vending machine crackers. And when I finished telling her, she did not offer a single word of comfort. She just nodded slowly, made a small sound in her throat, and slid a flashcard across the floor to me and said, "Quiz me on the cranial nerves." She understood, the way only people without families understand, that there is a specific kind of grief that gets worse, not better, when somebody tries to comment on it. We had been roommates since the spring of our 1st year. In the late summer before our 4th year began, Priya started getting tired in a way that did not make sense. By September, she had a cough that would not clear. By the 1st week of October, she was in our own teaching hospital's emergency department. And by the 3rd week, she had a diagnosis: an aggressive form of leukemia, the kind whose name the oncologist said slowly and gently, the way you say a thing you have had to say many times before. The numbers he gave us were not good numbers. He delivered them kindly. He had clearly delivered them kindly before. I went to my program director the next morning and laid it out plainly. Priya had no family. She had named me on every form in the hospital as her emergency contact and her healthcare proxy. There was no one else on the planet. I requested a formal leave of absence to be her caregiver through whatever the coming year turned into. My program director, a woman named Dr. Adeze Okonkwo, who had been at the hospital for nearly 30 years, looked at me across her desk for a long moment over the top of her glasses, and then she said, "Dr. Calderon, this will not be held against you. Take the time. Your position will be waiting when you return." She had me sign 3 documents. She had her assistant date and stamp them. She made me a copy and put it in my hand, and walked me to the door and shook it, and told me to call her cell phone directly if anything at all changed. I have thought about that handshake more times than I can count, because it turned out to be the last, completely uncomplicated act of kindness I would receive from anyone for a very long time. I moved into the 2nd bedroom of Priya's apartment that weekend. I drove her to her infusions. I held the basin during the long, terrible afternoons that came after. I sat in a vinyl chair in the oncology ward at 3 in the morning while the pain pushed through the medication and there was nothing to do but hold her hand and wait for it to recede. I learned in those months that caring for someone who is sick and caring for someone who is dying are two entirely different occupations, and that the second one takes everything you have and then quietly asks for the part you were saving. Sometime in the first week of November, I called Matteo. I am still not certain why I did. I think I needed one person inside my own family to know that something enormous and terrible was happening to me. And Matteo had spent the previous several years behaving like the only member of my family who cared whether I was alive. I told him about Priya. I told him about the leave of absence. I told him I would be back in the spring, after Priya either pulled through or did not. Matteo was, on that phone call, perfect. He was warm. He asked exactly the right questions in exactly the right order. He said, "Tess, take all the time you need. I'm so sorry. Don't worry about Mom and Dad. I won't say anything. You know how they spiral. Just be there for your friend." 48 hours later, he called our parents. I do not know the precise words he used. I would not learn the full architecture of what he had built for almost 7 years until I sat across a kitchen table from my father with a folder open between us. But the consequence reached me that same evening, at 11:18 at night, Eastern Time. I was sitting in the recliner beside Priya's hospital bed. She had been admitted that afternoon for a fever. My phone lit up on the windowsill, and it was my father, who had not called me of his own accord in more than a year. I answered. His voice was not angry. It was something far worse than angry. It was flat and cold and procedural. He said, "Tessa, your brother told us everything. The records you falsified, the dismissal, the lying you've been doing for months. We are done. Do not call this house again until you are prepared to be honest with your mother and me." I stood up out of the recliner and walked into the hallway so my voice would not carry to Priya. I said, "Dad, I don't know what Matteo told you, but none of that happened. I am on an approved leave of absence. I filed the paperwork. I am taking care of a friend who is dying. I can send you the documents tonight. I can give you my program director's direct number. I can give you the name of Priya's oncologist. Please, please just listen to me." He said, "Matteo told us you would say exactly that. He told us you would have a story ready." My mother got on the line. She was crying. She said, "Tessa, how could you? How could you lie to us like this? How could you do this to your father?" I said, "Mom, I am standing in a hospital right now. Please, just let me send you one PDF. It will take 3 minutes." She said, "I don't want any more papers from you, Tessa. I want a daughter who tells me the truth." And the line went dead. I stood in that corridor for a long time. I do not remember walking back into Priya's room. I do remember at some point later that night, my phone lighting up with a message from Matteo. I am going to quote it exactly, because the precise wording has been burned into me ever since. It said, "I'm so sorry, Tessie. I couldn't carry this for you anymore. I love you. Please get the help you need." He signed it with a small heart. He used my childhood nickname, the one he had not used since I was 6 years old, because he knew it would land in the message thread our parents shared and backed up, and he knew that at some point in the days to come, they would scroll up and read it. That message did not merely lie about me. It performed grief. It put him on the record as the loving, anguished brother who had been forced to tell a painful truth. And it locked the door behind me from the inside. What followed over the next several days was the most determined and most useless effort of my life. I called my father 19 times. The first several went to voicemail. Then his number stopped connecting at all. My mother blocked me the following morning. I sent 5 emails. The longest was 14 paragraphs. I attached the leave of absence form, signed and stamped. I attached a letter from Dr. Okonkwo. I attached a photograph of Priya in the hospital bed with the IV pole beside her. Not one of them was answered. I learned, years later, that my father had created an email rule that routed anything from my address into a folder he had labeled without quite knowing why he chose the word closed. He showed it to me eventually, across that kitchen table, with a kind of slow horror at himself. He said he had typed the word in without thinking. It had felt, he said, like filing something away. I wrote a letter by hand and mailed it priority from a post office in Durham. It came back the following week, the envelope unopened, my mother's handwriting across the front in blue ink. Return to sender. We had lived in that house my entire childhood. They had been at that address for more than 20 years. I called my aunt, my father's younger sister, my tia Marisol, the only person in my entire extended family who had treated Mateo and me throughout my whole life as though we occupied the same level of importance. She called my father that night. He hung up on her within a minute. She called me back, her voice low and shaking, and she said, "Tesita, he told me to stay out of it. He said you had finally shown them who you really are." She said, "Mija, I will fight this for you. But you need to understand that it is not going to be fast." It was not going to be fast. It was not going to be anything at all for nearly 7 years. On the 8th day, I stopped calling. I stopped writing. Not because I had given up on them, but because I had finally understood that what had happened was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with one more document. The misunderstanding was simply the lever Mateo had needed to pry open a decision my parents had been waiting 25 years to make. He had not invented their willingness to believe the worst about me. He had only handed them an excuse to act on it. They took the excuse because it was easier than the alternative. And the alternative was admitting that the quiet daughter had been telling them the truth about her own life for 2.5 decades, and that not one of them had ever bothered to listen. Priya died on the morning of December the 14th. It was a Thursday. The light coming in through the window of her hospice room was the thin gray winter light that the Carolina sky gives you in December, the color of a held breath. She had not been conscious for nearly 2 days. The monitor had been silenced at her request weeks earlier because she had said she did not want anyone in the room to have to listen to that sound. I was holding her right hand. The nurse on shift that morning, a woman named Deborah who had been with us for almost 6 weeks, saw her stop breathing before I did. She did not say anything. She simply put a hand on my shoulder and left it there. We sat together for nearly half an hour before either of us called anyone, because there was no one to call. I planned the funeral. 9 people came. 2 women Priya had stayed in touch with from one of her group homes, 4 of our classmates, Dr. Okonkwo, Deborah, a retired social worker who had known Priya when she was small. I stood at the front of a little non-denominational chapel and read a eulogy I had written at 4 a.m. the night before, sitting on the bathroom floor of Priya's apartment because it was the only room that did not still smell faintly of her. I did not cry while I read it. I had nothing left to cry with. I had been spending it for months, and the account was empty. That night, I sat on the floor of Priya's bedroom, surrounded by all of her things, none of which I had any legal claim to, and all of which she had left to me in a will she had quietly drawn up the previous summer, before any of us knew what was growing inside her. She had paid her lease through the following June. She had arranged and paid for her own cremation in advance, in cash, at a small funeral home she had visited alone in August and told no one about. And she had left a letter for me on the dresser. I keep it framed now, in my office at the hospital. It says, "Tess, there is more inside you than that family in Ohio ever let you spend. Go back. Finish. Become the doctor I'm not going to get to be. And on the days you want to quit because of them, I need you to remember one thing. Blood doesn't make a family. Showing up does. I showed up for you. You showed up for me. That's the whole thing. That's the only part that was ever real." I read that letter 11 times that night. By the time I read it the 12th, the sun was coming up. I opened my laptop and I filled out the re-enrollment paperwork, and I submitted it before 7 in the morning. I went back to the hospital in January. I had no money. I had no family. I had a 1-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and a half-finished bottle of anti-nausea tablets from Priya's last admission that I kept in the back of my refrigerator for 2 years because I could not bring myself to throw them away. I took out more loans. I picked up a weekend research position in the surgical lab. I ate the leftover sandwiches from morning conferences and stopped buying coffee anywhere except the cafeteria, where it was free. I finished. I graduated. No one from Ohio came. Tia Marisol flew down for the ceremony and sat in the 4th row and clapped harder when they called my name than any other person in that auditorium. Afterward, she pressed into my hand a small gold ring that she said had belonged to my grandmother, and that my grandmother had told her, in confidence before she died, that she wanted me to have when I finished my training. My grandmother had died during my 3rd year. I had not been told about the funeral until 12 days after it had already happened. Tia Marisol had called me from the parking lot of the cemetery, weeping to tell me. My parents had decided, by mutual agreement, not to inform me, because, my mother said later, they had not been sure I was in a stable enough place to handle it. I matched into a surgical residency at Ashford Memorial, a Level 1 trauma center in western Pennsylvania, about 100 miles from Cleveland. I chose it deliberately. I wanted to build my life eventually within driving distance of the family that did not want me. Not because I expected reconciliation, because I refused to be exiled. They were not going to push me out of my own corner of the country. That was the line I had drawn for myself, alone, in the empty apartment in the days after Priya's funeral. I would build a life on my own terms, in my own region, and I would not give them the satisfaction of having chased me away. In my 2nd year of residency, I met Dr. Margaret Soto. She was 63 at the time, the longtime chief of trauma surgery at Ashford, and one of the people who had helped design the trauma system for the entire western half of the state. She was precise, dry, and unimpressed by almost everything. She watched me run a code on a teenager who had come off a motorcycle on the highway, watched the whole thing from the doorway without saying a word, and then, on her way out of the bay, she said, "Calderon, you are very good, and you are very angry. And only one of those 2 things is useful to me. I'm going to teach you to keep the first and put down the second." She became, over the decade that followed, the closest thing to a parent I would have. In my 3rd year, I met Daniel Reyes, a high school chemistry teacher of all things, whom I met because his younger brother came into my trauma bay one night after a bar fight, and Daniel arrived at 2 in the morning in a panic, and the charge nurse pointed at me as the surgeon who had put his brother back together. He found me in the cafeteria an hour later, holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of me and said, "I didn't know how you'd take it, so I figured I'd let you doctor it yourself." I told him my entire story on our 3rd date. He listened to all of it without interrupting once. He did not look at me with pity, and he did not look surprised. When I finished, he set down his glass and said only, "Your family didn't deserve you. The good part is, the people who do are going to keep finding you." That was, more or less, the moment I knew. We were married 14 months later, in Margaret Soto's backyard, in October, under a rented tent because the forecast was uncertain. Daniel's father, a quiet retired postal carrier named Esteban, walked me down a short aisle between 2 rows of folding chairs. 26 guests. Tia Marisol was there. My grandmother, who was gone, was there in the gold ring on my finger. My parents were not there. I had mailed them an invitation 6 weeks earlier. It had come back unopened. When I had called Esteban to ask, haltingly, whether he would consider walking me down the aisle, he had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Tessa, that would be the 2nd greatest honor of my life. The first was raising the man you are about to marry." I had to set the phone down on the counter for a minute after that. After the ceremony, Margaret handed me a small, sealed envelope and told me not to open it that night, not for a while, that I would know when the time was right. I put it in a drawer in my home office and did not look at it for almost 3 years. The years passed. Daniel and I bought a narrow brick house with a crooked front step and a dogwood tree in the yard. We got a gray cat named Pancake who slept on the radiator. I became chief resident. I became a fellow. I became an attending. And 2 years ago, when Margaret Soto retired from her position as chief, she walked into my office, shut the door, sat down across from my desk and said, "Calderon, the board let me name my successor. I named you. Try not to embarrass me." I was 32 years old. 6 weeks later, I became the chief of trauma surgery at Ashford Memorial, the youngest person ever to hold the post. The envelope Margaret had handed me at my wedding, when I finally opened it, contained a letter of recommendation she had written and dated 3 years in advance, on the night of my wedding, in case the chief position ever came open. She had been planning it the entire time, and she had never said a word. Let me pause here for a moment. If you have ever lived in a family where one person's lie was somehow louder than your entire truth, where the people who were supposed to know you best made the deliberate choice to believe the worst, drop a single word in the comments. Drop the word louder. And if you have a sense of where this is heading, type the word reckoning. Because what happened next is the part where the structure my brother had spent 7 years maintaining finally met a weight it was never built to carry. Tia Marisol had been feeding me small pieces of information about my family over the years, carefully, reluctantly, always against my own stated wishes. I had told her early on that I did not want updates. But every so often, she would mention something in passing, and over time, I assembled a picture. My parents were well. My father had sold 2 of the dealerships and kept the 3rd. My mother had retired and taken up, in my aunt's words, an alarming amount of competitive baking. Mateo had married a woman named Brooke in a wedding I learned about 2 years after the fact. Brooke had divorced him 3 years into it, for reasons my aunt hinted at but would not detail. He had left the marketing agency, bounced through 2 more jobs, and was, in my aunt's careful phrasing, between things but managing. And then, in late October of last year, Tia Marisol called me with something different in her voice. She said, Tesita, I need to tell you some things about your brother. Things I think you have a right to know now. She had been carrying them for almost a year. 2 Thanksgivings before, she had finally confronted Mateo at the family table, in front of my parents, with the documentation she had been quietly collecting about my career off the hospital's public website. Mateo had glanced at the printouts, given a short laugh, and said, in front of 7 relatives, Thea, you're getting confused. Half the doctors in this country have a name like ours. That's not her. And my father had told my aunt, in front of everyone, that she was no longer welcome at his table if she was going to keep pushing what he called a fantasy. My aunt had left the dinner. She had driven home crying. She had not gone back the following year, and she had not told me any of it until now. She said, Tessa, I need you to understand. Your brother never stopped. For years, he has been telling people things about you that are not true. I heard him myself tell your cousin Daniela that you'd lost your license and were waiting tables in Florida. I heard him tell your grandmother, before she died, that you had refused to come and see her in her final weeks. None of it is true. I know none of it is true, and I have spent years trying to make your parents hear me, and they have made the choice, over and over, not to. I have to tell you all of it now, because I think something has shifted. I asked her what had shifted. She said, Last week I was at your mother's house. She went upstairs to find something, and I went into your father's office to look for a phone charger. There was a folder on his desk, a plain manila folder. It had your name written on the tab. She paused. Tessa. Inside that folder were printouts of your bio from the hospital, your photograph, the article about your promotion to chief. He has been collecting them for at least a year, and he has not said a word about it to anyone. I did not know what to make of that. I did not have time to figure out what to make of it, because 2.5 weeks later, at 2:11 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, my pager went off. I had been asleep for barely an hour. Daniel stirred. Pancake lifted his head off the radiator. The pager glowed in the dark. Level 1 trauma activation, single vehicle rollover, restrained driver, male, late 30s, blunt abdominal trauma, blood pressure falling. Estimated arrival, 8 minutes. I was dressed in 3 minutes and in the car in 5. The roads were wet and empty. I called the bay from the car. The charge nurse that night was a woman named Yolanda, whom I had worked beside for years, and she said, He's coming in unstable, Chief. We're set up in Bay 2. I said, Get Okafor scrubbed and standing by just in case. I did not yet know why I was asking for a second surgeon at the door. Some part of me, the part that has spent more than a decade running toward emergencies, must have caught something in the cadence of the dispatch. I ran the case in my head as I drove. Restrained driver, rollover, rigid abdomen, falling pressure. Likely a ruptured spleen, possible liver involvement, possible torn vessels in the mesentery. Standard playbook. I had done this operation hundreds of times. I walked into the bay at 2:19. The chart had already been uploaded to the workstation at the head of the room. I picked up the tablet to confirm the demographics and the working diagnosis. The patient's name on the screen said Mateo Calderon. Date of birth, the 11th of March. Next of kin listed, Rafael Calderon. Father. Address, the same house in Cleveland where I had grown up. I do not remember setting the tablet down. I remember very clearly looking up at the ceiling tile directly above the workstation and counting the small holes in it for what was probably no more than 2 seconds and felt like a full minute. I have learned to do this in the rare moments when something in my chest threatens to reach my hands. I stood very still. I counted the holes. I waited until they were only holes again. And then I turned to Yolanda and I said, I need to disclose a conflict of interest on the record. The patient is my brother. I have not spoken to him in 7 years. I am going to operate because I believe I am the most qualified surgeon in this building tonight to do it. But I want Dr. Okafor in the room with me, and I want every single step of this case documented. If at any point I am not the right person to be holding the instruments, you tell me, and I will step out without an argument. Yolanda, who had known only the broadest outline of my history, nodded once and said, Understood, Chief. Okafor's on his way. She did not say one more word about it. She is one of the people this world has never paid quite enough for. The ambulance pulled in at 2:22. 2 paramedics rolled my brother out on the board. His face was swollen on the right side where it had struck the window frame. There was a deep purple bruise blooming across his upper abdomen from the seatbelt. The medic at his head said, Pressure's been bottoming out. We've been running fluids the whole way. He went out twice on us. I said, Thank you. Let's move. And running in behind that ambulance, through the sliding doors, came my parents. My father in a winter coat thrown on over his pajamas. My mother in a long quilted housecoat, 1 slipper and 1 boot, her hair undone. The police at the scene had clearly called them, and they had gotten in the car and followed the ambulance down 100 miles of dark interstate. My father reached the triage desk first. He said loudly, in the voice of a man who has spent his whole life having his volume respected, That is my son. Where are you taking him? I want to speak to whoever is in charge. Get me the head of surgery. Yolanda, who had not yet seen my parents and had no reason on earth to know who they were, said, Sir, the head of surgery is the trauma surgeon on tonight, and she is already with your son. We need you to wait in the family lounge, and someone will come and find you the moment we have anything. My father leaned over the counter. I want to see the doctor in charge. Now. Yolanda stood up. She said, Sir, the doctor in charge is in the operating room. You are not going to see her right now. What I can do is take you to the family lounge. What I cannot do is take you 1 step closer to that operating room. My father opened his mouth to keep going, and my mother, behind him, put a hand on his arm and said, very quietly, Raphael, please, sit down. And he sat. He sat in the family lounge in his pajama shirt, and he held my mother's hand, and they waited. In the scrub room, I gave myself the only 30 seconds I would allow myself. I turned the water on hot, and I scrubbed from the fingertips up, the way I had done it 10,000 times. And I looked at the woman in the polished steel above the sink, and I said to her, in my head, the only thing that needed saying. The man on that table is the patient. The people in the lounge are the family. Tonight, you are not anybody's daughter, and you are not anybody's sister. Tonight, you are the surgeon. Operate. 3 hours and 40 minutes. That is how long it took to repair what the rolling vehicle had torn loose inside my brother. The spleen was ruptured beyond saving, and we took it. There was a moderate laceration of the liver, which we repaired in layers. 2 small mesenteric vessels had been pulled free and were bleeding, and we found them and tied them off. There was a contusion of the small bowel that I watched and decided to leave alone. We controlled the bleeding. We stabilized his pressure. We gave him 4 units of red cells, 2 of plasma, 1 of platelets. At 6:01 in the morning, I placed the last closing suture. Dr. Okafor, who had stood beside me the entire case and had never once been needed to do anything but stand there, pulled his mask down and said, "Clean case, Calderon."
You want me to update the family?
I peeled off my gloves and dropped them in the bin. I said, "No, Femi, I'll do it." He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Take a minute before you go." I said I would. I stood alone in the scrub room for 1 full minute. I did not cry. I checked my badge. I straightened my scrub top. I took 1 deep breath. And then I pushed open the doors and walked down the corridor toward the family lounge, which, at 6 o'clock in the morning in November, with snow starting outside the long window and the recessed lights humming overhead, is the longest walk in that entire building. The family lounge is a square room with rows of upholstered chairs and a television that murmurs the news at low volume in the corner. There was one other family in there, and they looked up when I came in. In the far corner, by the coffee machine, my parents were sitting beside each other. My father had his head in his hands. My mother was staring at the carpet. I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Calderon." They both looked up. The instant my father saw me, in scrubs, with my badge clipped to my collar, his whole face went still. He half rose from the chair and then sank back down, because his legs, I think, would not commit to a direction. My mother stood up. She did not come toward me. She just stood, one hand braced on the chair beside her, her mouth open, and no sound came out of it. I said, in the voice I have used 1,000 times for 1,000 other families, "I'm Dr. Calderon. I'm the chief of trauma surgery here. I was the operating surgeon on your son's case tonight. Mateo sustained a ruptured spleen, a moderate liver laceration, and 2 torn vessels in his abdomen. The surgery went well. He is stable. He's in the intensive care unit. You'll be able to see him in about 90 minutes, once he's settled." I paused. "Do you have any questions about the surgery itself?" My father did not take his eyes off the badge. He said, "Tessa." I said, "Mr. Calderon, do you have any questions about the surgery itself?" I had used his last name. I had used it the way you use the last name of a man you have never met before in your life. I watched it land. I watched it cut. My mother sank back down into her chair and put her hands over her face and made a small, high sound that was not quite weeping. Behind me, through the glass that separates the lounge from the corridor, I could see Yolanda watching, and 2 other nurses beside her. They had figured it out. The entire night shift had figured it out somewhere in the last 3 hours. Word travels through a hospital faster than blood. My father said, "Mateo told us." He stopped. He started again. "Mateo told us 7 years ago that you had been thrown out of your residency. He said—" He could not finish the sentence. He was looking at the badge. He was looking at the small Ashford memorial crest stitched above my pocket. He was looking at all of it and trying to fit it into a version of the world that had been built to hold none of it. I said, "Mr. Calderon, I am happy to discuss anything you want to discuss, but not tonight, and not in this room. Tonight, the only thing I need you to understand is that your son is alive and stable. The other conversation is going to be a long one, and we do not have time for it now. I have other patients." My mother spoke for the first time. She said, "Tessa, we tried to call you. After. We tried." She stopped because she knew, even as she was saying it, that it was either not true or had been true once, briefly, before they stopped trying. And she knew that I knew. She said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I did not say anything for a moment. There are responses I had imagined giving for 7 years, in the dark hours when I let myself imagine this conversation. Not one of them came to me. Instead, I said, very quietly, the only thing that was actually true. I said, Mom, I sent you 14 things over the course of 5 days. I sent you the leave of absence paperwork. I sent you my program director's phone number. I sent you a photograph of my friend dying in a hospital bed. I called 19 times. I asked Tia Marisol to talk to you. The last letter I sent came back unopened with your handwriting on the front of it. So when you tell me you tried to call me after, I'd like you to take a minute and think very hard about what the word after is doing in that sentence. She did not answer. She could not. I turned to go. As I turned, Yolanda pushed open the door from the corridor with a clipboard in her hand, having clearly waited for what seemed an appropriate moment. She said, Dr. Calderon, sorry to interrupt. The hospital president saw the overnight census and asked me to pass along his congratulations on the case. Also, the Committee for the Margaret Soto Award for Excellence in Trauma Surgery asked me to confirm you'll be at the announcement dinner next Friday. She said it the way she would have said it on any ordinary Tuesday. She did not know what she had walked into. She had no idea that the award she had just named, after my mentor, with my parents sitting 15 feet away, was the last stone in a wall that the woman in the housecoat had spent 7 years pretending did not exist. My mother made the small, high sound again. My father stood up, the way men of his generation stand up when they have lost something and do not know what to do with their hands. I said, Thank you, Yolanda. Tell the committee I'll be there. And I walked out. I did not see my brother again until the next morning. Mateo regained consciousness around 9. The ICU nurse paged me. I finished a note on another patient and walked over and went into his room alone. The lights were low. The monitor beeped softly. He lay in the bed with an oxygen cannula in his nose, his face mottled with bruising, looking, in the dim light, 10 years older than he was. His eyes tracked me as I came in. They tracked the badge. They tracked back to my face. His pupils, which had been almost relaxed, sharpened. I said, Good morning, Mateo. I'm your attending surgeon. You were in a rollover collision last night. You sustained a ruptured spleen and some additional injuries. We took you to the operating room. You're going to make a full recovery. The next day or 2 are the most important. We'll be watching you closely. Are you in any pain right now? He did not answer for almost 20 seconds. He just looked at me. I have, over my career, watched a great many people work a great many things out in a great many hospital beds. I have watched a man understand that his wife was not going to wake up. I have never, before or since, watched a face do what my brother's face did in those 20 seconds. It moved through disbelief, then recognition, then calculation, then fear. And then it settled, finally, into the old familiar expression of a man searching for the angle, like a coat he had worn his whole adult life and that no longer quite fit across the shoulders. He said, Tess, I said, Mr. Calderon, you don't need to say anything to me right now. You're my patient, and today, that is the only thing you are to me. I'm going to take care of you, because I took an oath, and because that is what I do. You and I will have a conversation about the other thing when you are well enough. But it does not happen in this room, and it does not happen until you are discharged. Do you understand? He nodded, once, a small nod. I checked his drains. I noted his output. I adjusted his pain medication. I documented in his chart, and then I left. The rest of it was not for me. The rest of it, as I learned later from Yolanda, who heard it from the ICU nurse, was for my parents, who came into Mateo's room at 10:14 that morning, and when my brother tried to begin his standard performance, the practiced tears and the soft voice and the gentle repositioning of the story, he found, finally, that he no longer had the audience he had always counted on. My father sat down in the chair beside the bed and said, very quietly, the first wholly honest sentence I had ever heard attributed to him in my entire life. He said, "Mateo, I am not asking you whether what your sister told us 7 years ago was true. I am telling you that I already know it was. I have known for at least a year. What I am asking you, right now, is why." And Mateo, the nurse said, did not cry. He did not produce any of his usual responses. He looked at our father, and then at our mother, and he said only, "Because she was going to be everything I was never going to be. And I needed her not to be." That was the entire answer. There was no second sentence. My father did not respond. My mother did not respond. They sat in the room for another half an hour, the nurse said, and no one spoke. At one point, my mother got up and walked to the bed and very gently smoothed my brother's hair off his forehead, and then she walked out. And she did not come back that day. Tia Marisol arrived at the hospital around noon with a leather portfolio under her arm. I do not know how she knew to come. I think Yolanda may have called her. She walked into the ICU lounge where my parents were sitting in 2 chairs that did not face one another, and she said, "I have been carrying this for 7 years. I am not carrying it any longer." She opened the portfolio. Inside were printouts of every email I had sent my parents in the days after Mateo's lie. There were screenshots of my call log showing the 19 attempts. There was a photocopy of the priority mail receipt for the letter that had come back unopened. There was the leave of absence paperwork, signed by Dr. Okonkwo and time-stamped a full month before any of the events in my brother's story. There was a copy of Priya's death certificate. There were photographs of my board certification, my graduation, my wedding. There was a letter, typed, from my husband's father, describing what it had been like to walk a stranger's daughter down the aisle. And at the very back of the folder, there was a single printed page that my aunt had been holding on to for almost 3 years. It was a screenshot of a text message Mateo had sent her in the autumn of the year I became an attending. It read, "Thea, please stop with the Tessa updates. Mom and Dad are finally at peace. Don't blow it up just because you can't accept that the family moved on without her." My aunt handed the folder to my mother and said, "Gloria, read it. Read all of it, every page. I will sit right here until you are finished." And she sat down across from them, and my mother read every page. And at some point, my father got up and walked to the window of the lounge and stood with his back to the room. And my aunt told me later that he stood there for nearly 2 hours and did not turn around. And that my mother read every single page. And that when she reached the screenshot of Mateo's message, she set the folder down on her knee and said out loud, to no one in particular, "We gave our whole lives to the wrong child." I came back up to the ICU floor that afternoon. My shift had ended hours before. I had not gone home. I had been in my office finishing paperwork I did not need to finish, drinking coffee I did not need to drink. My parents were still in the lounge. The folder was on the small table between them. They both stood when I came in. My mother said, "Tessa, we are not here to ask you for anything. I want to be clear about that. We just want you to know that we have read what your aunt brought, and we know what we did, and we are sorry. And we know the word sorry has no weight here but we wanted you to hear it from us." I said, "I appreciate that." My father said, "Tessa, I would like, at some point, if you ever wanted to, just to talk. Not to ask for anything, not to negotiate. Just to talk." His voice did the thing voices do when they are being held together by one fraying thread. He said, "I missed your wedding. I missed your graduation. I missed who you became. I missed who you have been the entire time. I want to be very clear that I understand exactly what I did and exactly what I failed to do. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you whether someday you might be willing to let me sit in a room with you. That is all." I said, "I'll think about it." I did not promise more than that. I did not feel a flood of relief or warmth or any of the things you are supposed to feel in such a moment. What I felt was something quieter and far more useful. I felt, for the first time in 7 years, like the person in the room who held the power. Not the power to punish, the power to decide. There is a difference. I had spent 7 years being decided about. Standing in that lounge in scrubs with my badge on, I was, for the first time, the one doing the deciding. That, more than anything else that happened that day, was the moment something turned over. I went home. Daniel was waiting. Pancake was asleep on the radiator. The house was warm. The dogwood outside the kitchen window was bare against the gray. Daniel poured me a glass of wine I did not drink and sat with me on the couch and asked nothing for over an hour. And when I finally began to talk, he listened, the way he always listens, which is the way Priya once told me a real person listens, which is with his whole face. 2 weeks later, Matteo was discharged. I waited another month. I did not contact him, and I did not contact my parents. I returned my mother's 2 careful messages with short, polite texts. I let everyone breathe. When I was ready, I emailed my brother and gave him the name of a small coffee shop in a town halfway between his place and mine. I told him the meeting would last 1 hour. I told him Daniel would be sitting at a separate table in the same room because that was a condition I needed, not a punishment I was handing out. He agreed. He did not push back. He arrived first. When I walked in, I almost did not recognize him. He had lost weight, the way you lose weight after surgery, and then keep losing because something has gone out of you. He was wearing a sweater that no longer fit him. He looked, for the first time in my memory, his actual age. I sat down across from him. I did not order anything. I said, "Matteo, we're going to do this now. We're going to do it once. I am not going to do it a second time." He nodded. I said, "I want to know why. Not the answer you gave Dad in the ICU, the real one, the whole thing." He took a long breath, and he told me. He said he had been the favorite his entire life, and that he had built his whole understanding of who he was on the foundation of being the one our parents loved more. He said that when I got into medical school, he had felt the floor start to slide out from under him, that he had known instinctively that if I became a surgeon, the whole family would quietly reorganize itself around me, and that he could not survive being second. So he had called me to keep track of me, not out of love, but to find the weakness, the thing he could use. And when I told him about Priya and the leave of absence, he had known, the instant the words left my mouth, exactly what he was going to do with them. He had made the lie airtight. He had made it preempt the truth, because he had known the next call I would make would be to our parents, and he had wanted his version to arrive first and to make mine sound like exactly what a liar would say. He told me he had tried, 2 years earlier, to sabotage my career, that he had called my old hospital pretending to be a reporter and asked about my disciplinary record. He told me he had not slept a full night in 7 years. I did not say anything for a while. When I finally spoke, all I said was, "Thank you for the honest version. That is the first true thing you have said to me in 20 years." He started to cry, and not the performing kind, the other kind. He said, "Tess, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not even asking to be in your life. I just need you to know that I know what I did and who I have been. And the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I could not stop thinking about lying in that bed, is that you saved my life. After all of it, you walked into that room and you saved it. You did not have to." I said, "I took an oath. That was not for you." He said, "I know." I said, "Here is what is going to happen, Mateo. You are going to write an email to the entire extended family. Tia Marisol has the list. You are going to tell them the truth, every story you ever planted, and you are going to correct all of it, completely, in writing. You are going to keep going to therapy for years, not months, and Tia Marisol is going to know whether you are still going, and she is going to tell me only that, only whether you are still going. And you and I are not going to be the kind of brother and sister you may now imagine we could become. We may, eventually, be something. We are not going to be friends. We are not going to pretend we ever had a relationship of the kind we never actually had. If you contact me, it will be for things that matter, and I will respond when I want to respond. This is not a punishment. It is the only way I know to find out whether the man who did what you did is genuinely trying to become a different one." He nodded to all of it. I stood up and I left, and Daniel rose from his table and followed me out. And I did not cry on the drive home. I cried that night, briefly, when I got into bed, and then I slept 9 hours, which was the longest I had slept in months. My parents began counseling 6 weeks after the night in the ICU. They did not tell me. Tia Marisol told me they were seeing a therapist in Cleveland twice a week. My mother took to it. My father, by my aunt's account, sat through the first 3 sessions in near silence, the way men of his generation often do. And then, in the 4th, something gave way. He came home from that session and went into his office and took every page out of the manila folder marked with my name and laid them all out across his desk and sat reading them, in order, for the rest of the afternoon. My mother brought him coffee at 5. He did not look up. He said only, "Gloria." I let her become a stranger. I'm the one who did that, not Mateo. Me. My mother told my aunt later that it was the first time in their entire marriage she had heard him take sole ownership of a thing he had done, without softening a single edge of it. Mateo sent the email. 41 recipients. My aunt confirmed delivery to every one. It was 3 short paragraphs with no qualifications and no self-pity in any of them. It said that he had lied 7 years earlier about his sister's situation, that the lie had been deliberate, that he had maintained and expanded it for 7 years, that his sister Tessa had never abandoned the family, that she had been the one who was abandoned, and that anything anyone in the family had heard about her from him during those years should be regarded as false. The replies my aunt forwarded ranged from stunned silence to short notes that simply said, Thank you for telling us. Tessa, we're so sorry. My great-aunt, my grandmother's sister, 90 years old, called me from her care home and said, Tessita, I am too old to undo any of this, but I want you to know I never believed it. Not really. I should have said so out loud. I am saying it now. I told her there was nothing to forgive, and I told her I loved her, which were words I had not said to anyone in my extended family in 7 years. And they were not as hard to say as I had always assumed they would be. The award dinner was on a Friday at the end of November, in a hotel ballroom, 300 people. I wore a dark green dress. Daniel wore the suit he had worn at our wedding. Margaret Soto sat at our table. Tia Marisol sat at our table. Dr. Okafor and his wife sat at our table. The Margaret Soto Award for Excellence in Trauma Surgery, which had been named after my mentor the year before, was given to its first recipient that night. I walked up to the stage, and the applause went on longer than I expected. I had prepared a speech. I had rewritten it 4 times. I said that 7 years earlier I had nearly stopped, that I had sat in an apartment after the death of a friend who had no family, with no family of my own willing to pick up the phone, and that I had picked up a letter off her dresser that said, in unsteady handwriting, that blood does not make a family, that showing up does. I said that the people who had shown up for me had built the surgeons standing on that stage. I named Margaret Soto. I named Daniel. I named Tia Marisol. I named Priya Anand, in full, on the record. I said that medicine, at its center, is a discipline made entirely of people who choose to show up for strangers, and that I had been lucky enough to find, in my professional family, the version of family I had once believed I would simply have to learn to live without. And then I said, almost as an afterthought, that I had recently been asked to extend that same definition of showing up to people who had not, when it counted, shown up for me. That I was not yet sure what that would look like. That I was, however, willing to find out. And that for anyone in that room who had spent years waiting for their own family to finally see them, I had only one piece of advice. Stop waiting. Build the life that belongs to you, in your own name. And if and when they ever turn around, let them find a door that you alone control, that you alone decide whether to open. I sat back down. Daniel took my hand under the table. Margaret leaned over and said in my ear, Calderon, that is the second best speech I've ever heard you give. I said, what was the first? She said, your wedding vows, and squeezed my hand once and let go. In the very back row of the ballroom, in 2 seats my aunt had quietly arranged a week earlier without telling me, were my parents. They had asked, through her, for permission to attend. I had said yes. I had said yes because the speech I gave was not going to be a different speech, whether they were in the room or not. And because I wanted to be the kind of person who can give the same speech, whether or not the people who hurt her are sitting in the back listening to it. My father, my aunt told me afterward, did not move during the entire speech. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes on me. My mother cried, quietly, the whole way through. When I sat down, they stayed in their seats. They did not approach me at the reception. They had agreed with my aunt that the evening was not theirs. They left before the dessert was served, and on his way out, my father stopped in the lobby and asked my aunt to pass along a single message. He said, "Tell her I came, and tell her she doesn't have to do anything with that." It is March now. The dogwood in the front yard has not yet come into bud. The snow is mostly gone. Daniel is in the kitchen, making coffee, and Pancake is asleep across my feet. And I am writing this in my home office, where the gold ring that belonged to my grandmother sits in a small dish on the desk beside Priya's letter in its frame, and beside a third object that arrived in the mail 2 weeks ago. The third object is a photograph. It came in an envelope with no return address, but I recognize the handwriting. It is a photograph of me at 10 years old, sitting on the steps of the convention center, holding the blue rosette from the citywide Young Scientists competition.
I had never known anyone had taken it.
The photograph is slightly blurred, shot from a distance, the way you take a picture when you do not want the person to know they are being watched. On the back, in my father's handwriting, it says only the topic of the project I had won on: water filtration. And under that, 4 more words. I should have asked. I'm asking now. There is no signature. I have not yet replied to it. I will. I have not decided in what form. Perhaps a letter. Perhaps a phone call. Perhaps an invitation to sit for 1 hour in a coffee shop halfway between Cleveland and here, the way I sat with my brother. I have not decided. I have time. For the first time in a very long while, I have time. If you have been listening to all of this, and any part of it has felt like your own life, I want you to hear one thing before I let you go. The truth has no expiration date. It does not matter whether it has been 5 days or 5 years or 20. The truth has a kind of quiet patience to it. It is willing to wait. It is very often the last thing left standing in the room after everything louder has worn itself out. And when it finally does speak, it does not need to shout. It only needs to be the thing that is still there when the noise is gone. I never wanted revenge on my brother. I became instead a person who did not need it. I built a life that did not require their approval to exist, and I let the truth take all the time it needed to arrive. And when it arrived in a trauma bay at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the worst night of my brother's life, and one of the most ordinary nights of mine. It arrived not because I summoned it, but because I had spent 7 years showing up, in scrubs, in operating rooms, at the bedsides of strangers, building exactly the kind of life in which the truth would eventually have somewhere to land.
If you are waiting for your family to finally see you, please, I am asking you, do not wait. See yourself first. Build the life that is yours and put your own name on it. Choose the people who choose you back. And if one day the ones who did not choose you find their way to the door of that life, do not throw it open and do not slam it shut. Stand in it, look at them, and then decide. The decision is yours. It was always yours. They simply spent a very long time hoping you would never find that out. My name is Dr. Tessa Calderon. I am 34 years old. I am the chief of trauma surgery at Ashford Memorial. I am married to a man who chose me. I am the niece of a woman who never once stopped fighting for me. I was the student of a mentor who wrote my recommendation 3 years before I needed it and never said a word. And I am, slowly, carefully, on a timeline that belongs to no one but me, beginning to consider becoming, once again, somebody's daughter. Not the daughter they wanted, the daughter I actually am, which turns out to be the only one I was ever willing to be. There is a photograph on my desk of a girl on a set of stone steps holding a blue ribbon who believed, that afternoon, that she was sitting there entirely alone,
It turns out she was not. It only took 24 years for the person who was watching to finally say so. I am not yet sure what I am going to do with that. But I have, at last, the rest of my life to decide.